James, what do you think the best theme song ever is?
Oh, if we're talking sports, I know we're talking Hava Nagila.
The classic horror tune brought to you at any hockey arena on the old organ.
I know we can't be there in person, but we got the next best thing. We've got our own new intro music.
Special thanks to Kobe Lipovich, wears number 8 for the Toronto Bar Mitzvah Club. He's dropping those dimes and sinking those shots from key to key as he brings us his version of Hava Nagila. I think it goes up somewhere between the Harry Belafonte and the Bob Dylan version of each. Thank you so much, Kobe, a member of our listener community and the CJN community, for providing us with this wonderful rendition of a classic song. Shalom Aleichem, sports fans. You're here with the Menschwarmers, the podcast about Jews and sports. My name is Gabe.
I'm Jamie, and welcome back to another fascinating and funny discussion about the world of Jews and sports. We've got a great episode for you. We have a interview coming up soon with Andrew Moranis, the writer of several books, including Games of Deception, a book about the 1936 Summer Olympics.
Not the best Olympics for our people.
No, not the best Olympics for our people. It was held in Berlin, in the heart of Nazi Germany at the time, but a fascinating book. Also the author of a recent book, Singled Out, about Glenn Burke, the first gay Major League Baseball player. And we're going to get to that. It's going to be a lot of fun. But first, there is a big anti-Semitic Jewish sports controversy that needs to be discussed right now.
And we gotta make with the yucks about it.
Well, I don't know about make with the yucks. It's pretty bad, but
no, it's a bad one.
Okay, we'll poke some fun.
We had a man do a big anti-Semitism on Twitch.
Yeah, so let's go through the facts. Myers Leonard, who's like a probably like 8-9 year NBA vet at this point, plays with Miami Heat, although he's a bench player, glorified cheerleader kind of guy. For some reason, he also streams video games. I guess that's sort of like a pretty happening side job for lots of
I think a lot of the like fringe NBA players seem to. Well, I think they play a lot of video games because they're 25 years old, and they seem to do so on Twitch because you can make some money. People watch it.
He had sponsors for it, which I guess is something we'll discuss. Anyways, he I guess got killed playing Call of Duty, and he used the K word. We're gonna go with. He didn't use it at anyone Jewish per se, but he just
used it as a general insult.
Yeah, the K word. We're gonna decline to say it on air. It's Enrique Hernandez's nickname. If you read it.
If you wanna look it up, you can. One thing I found I want to say right off the bat, I found about this discourse is a lot of the American media, especially a lot of Jewish American media, talked about that it's not a very common insult for Jews, and therefore he must have known, that it was a particular word. He must be familiar with it.
Right.
But I actually, having watched School Ties, I believe it's probably the most common insult to Jews. So I didn't understand that part of the discourse. I think it's a fairly common word that's thrown around.
Well, that was.
Do you agree?
I think so. Part of his apology was to say, I didn't know what the word meant at the time. My ignorance about its history and how offensive it is to the Jewish community is absolutely non-excuse, and I was just wrong. So there aren't that many slurs for Jews that I think are in common use. Like, I guess Yid and Heb, neither of which I think are as offensive. Like, there was Heat magazine.
And Yid in Tottenham, as you could hear our previous episode with Dave Goss talking about it.
They also have a non-negative context. And then there's some older things like Sheeny, which I feel like I've only heard in School Ties. Like,
that's also big in School Ties.
So like, I don't think anyone's ever called someone sorry, not ever, but recently. No one is swearing
Damon drops
on
that bomb a whole lot. That's it.
In the movie. No disrespect to Matt Damon.
I think outside of your, Connecticut prep school football team, probably not one you hear all that often.
Right. And so then the K word, again, I think is known, and I think is, a thing that's used against Jews in an anti-Semitic way. I don't have personal experience with it, I don't think, but I do think he knew what it meant. I mean, I think it's ridiculous.
Of course he knew what it meant.
Why would you say something that you don't know what it means? It's sort of ridiculous to say I didn't know what it means and then not provide further explanation about that. Like if he said like, "Oh, I thought it meant uncool or lame." It's like, well, that's it. You didn't know its origin or anything like that. I mean, people had a similar discussion, I guess, with the let's say the other F word not that long ago, and people were saying, "Well, I didn't mean it to be homophobic. I just meant it as a slur." And it's like, but you knew it's from a homophobic slur. You know, it's from a homophobic place, right? Keeping with the now deceased Kobe Bryant's use of that F word on the bench. I mean, Myers was fined $50,000 and suspended for a week from the Miami Heat, which doesn't really matter because he wasn't playing anyways. But I guess that's. How do you feel about that penalty? What do you think?
I mean, I think that it seems that there's sort of a boilerplate standard penalty for any sort of did a bad thing in the NBA. Right. You look at a lot of the comparables. It's hard to find someone who has been suspended for more than that and fined more than that. Even for something like domestic violence or drug use or, any of those equally serious but more violent crimes.
Yeah.
That said, repeated recreational drug use is very frowned upon in the NBA. So depending on your belief about Robert Swift doing too much heroin, he got a worse suspension than Myers Leonard did.
Sure. That was quite a while. That was some time ago, I guess. I mean, it is interesting to see these suspensions for saying something that was clearly offensive. This wasn't in a game, but obviously players say things in the heat of the moment that are not necessarily as bad, not necessarily racial slurs, but I don't know. I think they did. I think a week suspension and $50,000 seems about right. I don't know that he deserves to never play again in the NBA. On the other hand, I mean, Mickey Aronson, who owns the Heat, is Jewish. He plays for Miami.
There's a lot of Jewish fans. And one thing that I think strikes me as different from this one, which might give some, fewer problems for him or might warrant a less severe suspension, is that it's not like he, yelled it at Denny Avdija in the middle of a game.
That's true. That's true.
He said it functionally in his personal life. And yes, he should absolutely be punished for doing so publicly, especially because he has to apologize and not represent his team. But this wasn't necessarily a basketball related thing. He just sort of did something that proved he was a bad person and is therefore suffering the consequences for it. That said, it reflects his, importance in the community and his stance as a public figure, that with lots of people watching this stream, right? If he was playing with just his friends and said it, we would have never heard about it. But somebody saw it, put it on Twitter, and sort of it got repeated as something, that was represented with him. Ironically, the same thing happened during a game when he refused to kneel for the national anthem with the rest of his teammates.
That's true. I mean, I feel like that sort of makes me not want to give him much of the benefit of the doubt. It's if you're the only teammate and the only player on the team and, a noticeably white player on a mostly black NBA team refusing to kneel for the anthem, I feel like you are sort of aware of the politics of our times, and you're not just ignorantly going through the world without a care. So,
oh yeah, there's a Bill Burr joke about people who are upset about kneeling for the anthem, where Colin Kaepernick kneels for the anthem, and there's some guy out somewhere who goes, "My brother once knew a firefighter, and because of that, I refuse to believe in this."
Yeah, so I think he was already painting himself as that sort of guy. I don't really know what the answer is. I don't know that he should never play again. I don't know that he shouldn't have a chance. Maybe he won't play again in Miami because, it's a pretty Jewish and I'm sure vocally Jewish fan base. And
oh yeah, he's also, I mean, thankfully there's no fans because when they go to Brooklyn, he's going to get the shit beat out of them.
Yeah, that's true. Look, it would be interesting to know what would happen in the heat of the moment of a game if something similar were to happen. It's not exactly the same, I don't think, but I think that if a white player were to use the N-word against a black player in a game, they probably would be not playing in the NBA anymore. And I'm not saying that this is the same. It wasn't a game. It wasn't directed at a Jewish player. And obviously, there has been a reaction that's suitable. But it remains interesting that this is, there's a limit on it. And I think, disappointingly, the reaction was not swift and universal condemnation. It wasn't. There have been a trickle of NBA players who have now come out and made a comment about it, but not universally, and not the most vocal people coming out immediately.
What I thought was very interesting, and I think this is reflective of the relative cultures, and specifically about the NBA. And I understand they have a lot more lawyers and they have a lot more public facing, but I think the sort of ethnic racial, religious slurs are somewhat common in the gaming lifestyle.
Yeah, that seems to be true.
I think,
yeah.
And I think for that reason is why we saw his gaming sponsors and, the leagues he plays in and the game itself immediately disavow him and condemn him much faster than anybody involved with the NBA did.
Yeah, good kudos to them for coming down hard and quickly. I mean, I think they sort of understood the reaction, and people were sort of joking about this on Twitter when the Miami Heat's initial statement was like, we're reviewing the video, and it's sort of like reviewing the video. There's not that much to review.
They say we're not a litigious people.
Again, all these situations are difficult. You don't know how to react necessarily. There's a first time for these things, but I think the reaction has been okay, and I think hopefully people are more careful about what they do. Hopefully people, I don't know, don't use anti-Semitic slurs on publicly available streams and things like that. And we'll see if there's any progress.
As I was saying, I think it's a much more acute problem relative to the NBA as it is in the esports world. At least, you hear a lot about people. I don't know if I've ever played an online game where people shoot at each other in my life. I find on MLB The Show, racial slurs seem to stay out of it a lot. But on Call of Duty, it might be somewhat more commonplace. So I think the people involved in that in those communities are working a lot harder and a lot faster because it's a much more acute problem than the NBA for right now. That said, I think your point stands about, we don't necessarily hear or what would happen if somebody, said the N-word or something. As we know what happens when somebody uses an anti-gay slur or an anti-black slur, we're not quite sure of yet. So it sucks that we had to be the test case in the NBA for this. But it seems that there's somewhat of a boilerplate punishment in 2021 for such an event.
I would say that the one person we know was subjected to racial slurs while he was playing was Jeremy Lin. He said that, people said many anti-Asian slurs at him when he was playing, and there wasn't much action about that. Now, his heyday was more like 8 years ago, so maybe that's when that was happening, and he was the first notable, or not first notable, but the first big Asian American player who made it big, and maybe things will change. I think one good thing that came out of this, we did get an open letter from Julian Edelman, wide receiver. Oh my goodness, where did he play last year? I can't remember now. Anyways, but Julian Edelman wrote an open letter to Myers Leonard, sort of saying he didn't think he used that word out of hate, but out of ignorance, and inviting him to a Shabbat dinner down in Miami sometime. So, good for Julian Edelman, certainly embracing his role as a very, prominent Jewish athlete, a mensch. I will say, though, on the other hand, that the one thing I just don't care about is like a public rehabilitation tour for Myers Leonard, like, breaking ground on a new wing of a Holocaust museum or something like that. I don't care. I mean, he can continue to play, and we can think about him as little as we've thought about him these many years. And
these many years.
Yeah. So anyways, I think we've covered most of the Myers Leonard. So I don't know there's much else to say. It's unfortunate. I mean, it is interesting as an example of how quickly these things spread. I mean, certainly we heard about it within a few minutes, and people were sort of telling us about it, wanting a comment about these sorts of things.
It's nice that this is a good opportunity to shout out to our fans and listeners that we're now looked to when a professional athlete does an anti-Semitism. We're glad you want to hear from us.
Yeah.
That was a busy day on Twitter.
That's right. So, twice, 2 or 3 times a year, we will be called upon to make these judgment calls and, demand justice be meted out quickly. So I think that was our big Jewish news story this week. Unfortunately,
I had one more thing to say, which I found ironic, is that you use a anti-gay slur or an anti-Jewish slur. I'm sorry, you use an anti-Jewish slur while playing Call of Duty, what I believe to be a World War II video game in which you play as the Americans. Whatever U.S. Army propaganda goes to the development of that game, maybe didn't work on him.
Let me ask you something. You said something about being subjected to certain comments when you're playing MLB The Show. When you're playing the show, are you on voice chat with somebody else, the person you're playing against?
You can be. I've never been on. Is
the other person on voice chat sometimes just telling you like, "Hey, I think you
have to both opt in."
That just sounds like really funny, but I would love to hop on MLB The Show and do play by play for a game. Do people do? I would love to do that.
Like you have a third party doing play by play. Well, I've been trying to create a all Jewish team. It's hard, and there aren't very many, but I'm trying.
Well, why don't you say that for next episode? We'll talk about Major League Baseball, which is starting in a few weeks. New seasons coming.
And we can talk about our all-Jewish starting lineup.
Yeah, I mean, baseball, the most Jewish of sports in terms of the amount of pro athletes currently. So lots of Jewish athletes to talk about in baseball. I know we have lots of baseball fans out there, so we'll give a good preview of the 2021 season that's going to start in a few weeks. For now, let's head to our interview with Andrew Moranis. We're joined today by Andrew Moranis, who is a writer, who's author of a number of books, including the new book, Singled Out, The True Story of Glenn Burke, a story about the first openly gay baseball player, and also Games of Deception. Just want to get the full subtitle here. It's a big one, Andrew. Yeah. The True Story of the First U.S. Olympic Basketball Team at the 1936 Olympics in Hitler's Germany, which won a award from Jewish librarians, and something we want to talk to you about. We'd love to talk to you a little bit about the new book, but I think it would be great to talk a little bit for our listeners about the book about the 1936 Olympics and the issues of anti-Semitism that were pervasive to those games. I've really enjoyed reading the book and learning a lot of these stories about some of these older Jewish athletes and these stories I didn't know about. One in particular I thought was very interesting was about Sam Balter, who was the only Jewish member, or the one Jewish member of the U.S. Olympic basketball team that won gold.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on your podcast. I think you've got the best titled podcast that I've ever heard of.
Thank you.
Good.
So, yeah. So I was really looking forward to talking to you guys. Games of Deception was a really interesting book for me to write. You know, I'm a big basketball fan and had no idea that it was the 1936 Olympics where basketball got its start in the Olympics until I was visiting University of Kansas on a book tour for my first book. And I really wanted to see Allen Fieldhouse, where the Jayhawks play basketball, and saw a picture of James Naismith with a Japanese basketball player. And they had the original rules of basketball under glass there, you know, and the tour guide said, did you know the inventor of the game was able to see it debut at the Olympics? And so that sort of set me off on the research for this book. And along the way, I learned the story of Sam Balter, who you mentioned, who was the only Jewish American to win a gold medal at the 36 Olympics in Berlin. And he played for the Universal Studios basketball team, which made up half of the U.S. Olympic team that year. And you can ask more questions about that. But,
I thought that was a very fascinating a part of the story, that, you know, the team, half the team was the Universal Pictures, like the movie studio was their company team. And that was the way things were done back then. They sort of hired good athletes, you know, in Joe jobs so that they could play the game and be part of the team. And Sam Balter was one of those guys who'd been sort of a high school star, and there wasn't professional basketball in the same way we think about it now as a way of getting ahead, or as just the beginnings of that. But that's how he sort of got to be part of that Universal team and made it to the Olympics.
That's right. He had played collegiately at UCLA, and the studio would hire former college basketball players to work on the movie sets, you know, really just so they would be there to be on the basketball team. And it was a way in the 1930s to promote their movies, you know, to have this basketball team traveling around with Universal on their chest. And they would bring a big banner with them to the games that had the names of movie stars like Boris Karloff, you know, and directors of the time, of the era. Jack Pierce was the head makeup artist at the movie studio back then, and he was considered sort of the manager of the team. They didn't even really have a coach, but he had created the looks for Frankenstein and Hunchback of Notre Dame, and would dress up the players in these character costumes before the games, and they would come out and entertain the crowd.
This is like Mr. Burns with the nuclear plant softball team.
Right.
Exactly. It's the same concept. The other half of the team was from a tiny town in Kansas called McPherson, Kansas. They worked for an oil refinery there. And what they created the first Olympic team was, instead of the best players, you know, being invited to be on the team or trying out for the team, they had a national tournament. And this was in the days before March Madness. There was no, you know, major college basketball tournament at the time. And they said, whichever two teams make it to the championship game of the tournament at Madison Square Garden, we'll combine those two teams, essentially a couple players left off, you know, to be the first U.S. Olympic basketball team.
Just getting to the games was itself a bit of a challenge. And I knew a little bit about the Berlin Olympics as the sort of way for Nazi Germany to show itself off to the world. But I didn't realize how much opposition there had been domestically in the United States and other countries about a potential boycott, in large part because, of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. Reports about that, the fact that there weren't going to be Jewish athletes competing for Germany at the time. And I just thought that was a very interesting part of the story. Ultimately, everybody did go, and Jesse Owens and other black athletes joined or were a big part of the American team, and part of what made that Olympics so historic in the end.
Yes, I was surprised too. Like you said, I hadn't realized the extent of the boycott effort in the United States and in other countries. I've got a picture in the book of tens of thousands of people marching through the streets of New York, protesting the idea of going to those Olympics. I visited the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati as I was researching this book to listen to a sermon by Rabbi Stephen Wise about 2 years prior to the Olympics, where he's making the case why we should not go to these games. Sam Balter, who you mentioned, he had a big decision to make whether he was going to participate in the Olympics or not after he earned the right to go there. And I thought it was interesting. He decided obviously to go, and he listened to a lot of people, talked to a lot of Jewish leaders to get their thoughts about whether, it was a good idea to go or not. And he, till his dying day, even with the benefit of hindsight and knowing what happened in the Holocaust and World War II, said he was still, proud that he had gone. As a young man and deciding to go, he thought the best way that he could stand up to Hitler and to these notions of Aryan supremacy, was to go there and perform well and win a gold medal. And that, that would show the fallacy of those arguments. And Jesse Owens felt the same way. Right. He was getting a lot of pressure from black leaders not to go, but they both went, they both performed well, won gold medals. And to some degree, especially in Jesse Owens' case, are celebrated for what they did. However, you can't really say that by going and competing that they changed the course of history in any way for the better, or were necessarily treated better even in their own country when they came back.
I find it very interesting to consider the story of Helen Meyer in the same Olympics at the same, at the same time. As she was actually, some of our listeners might know this, and I'm sure you know this, but she was, I guess, deconsecrated from Germany and was living in exile in the United States when she went back to compete for Germany in the 36 Olympics.
Right.
As a Jewish athlete.
As a Jewish athlete, and was used sort of to further the propaganda that you guys have been talking about. That was the whole purpose of why Hitler was excited to host the Olympics. Germany had been awarded the Olympics prior to him coming into power. And initially he, wasn't in favor of this sort of international event taking place in his country, but his propaganda ministers convinced him it would be good propaganda, not only to the world and to try to fool the world into thinking that everything was fine there, but really to make their own case with German citizens, and to show, that we're essentially endorsed by the world who's coming here for the Olympics. They wouldn't be coming, if we weren't popular, if we weren't good. And so, inviting Meyer back to compete for Germany, especially because she, had the Jewish background, was really important to them. And there's pictures of her, famous pictures of her with, raising her arm in the Hitler salute.
Absolutely.
At those Olympics. It's really spooky to see.
Which she later said was, I think this is debated, but what she later said was to spare her family arrest.
Right. Was the reason why she went, Right. So it's easy to sit here in 2021 and condemn her for going, but you don't know exactly what was happening in her life. I also wrote about Gretel Bergman, the Jewish high jumper, who, was in Germany for part of the lead up to the Olympics, but then was living in London and thought she had a chance to really try out, a legit chance to try out for the German Olympic team, and wanted to.
Yeah.
And then was cut from the team at the very last minute after the United States had already set sail for Germany, after it would be too late to boycott the games.
And you so mean literally set sail?
They're on the boat, right? Yeah, they didn't fly. They took the SS Manhattan from New York Harbor, and it wasn't until they were out in the Atlantic Ocean that it was, that Bergman was moved from the team, and it was realized that it was all a farce. She never had a chance to make it in the first place.
And it does seem likely that she would have medaled, that she was setting records, or hitting jumps that were within the contention. Certainly,
absolutely, she deserved to be on the team. Yeah.
It's interesting to see, we're 80 plus years since then. And, these same issues continue to come up every Olympics, or certainly at least every Olympics that's held in parts of the world that don't necessarily have human rights or respect for human rights in the way that we want in the West, or democratic rights. I don't know how much press has gotten in the States so far, but in Canada, there's been more of a organized movement around boycotting the Beijing 2022 Winter Games, and it seems unlikely that anything's going to happen. But here we are all these years later, and people are saying the same thing about this is just going to be a propaganda opportunity for the CCP or for Russia when Sochi was hosting the games.
I've noticed, and this might just be a hunch, but I've noticed that countries with bad human rights records tend to get awarded the Olympics a little more than regularly. There might be some skullduggery going on with that IOC. Just a hunch.
I think you're right. I mean, the links between fascism and the Olympic movement have been there for 100 years. And, the 1932 Olympics had been held in Los Angeles at a time when racial segregation in the United States, anti-Semitism in the United States, a massive deportation of Mexican-American citizens, in the months leading up to those Olympics.
Sure.
I'm sure there's countries, when LA hosts the Olympics here in a couple years, thank God Trump's not president anymore, but, you could make the same arguments about why they would want to come participate in an American Olympics if it was going to be used for Trump's propaganda purposes.
Sure.
Well, there's always, we're getting a little sidetracked talking about Olympic history here, which I'm super into, but there's always a couple of countries that boycott the Olympics without us knowing. Like there'll be an Olympics. I'm serious. There'll be an Olympics in South Korea that, because of some political disagreement, just picking a country, Estonia will decide, we're not going to participate. Nobody really notices. But when it comes to a country like China or the United States, it becomes a much larger political issue, especially, in Canada, at least, where we all are. There's a lot of sort of political intrigue right now with the ethics of China. I mean, our parliament, for example, just sort of condemned the Chinese government. Who knows what it means? But there is official statements going on about issues in the world right now.
There was Andrew. There is another important Jewish story in the book that I think we should talk about as well, and that's the benching of the two American runners in the 4x100 meter finals. That was Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller who were benched in part. This is what allowed Jesse Owens to get his fourth gold medal, but it was done to appease Hitler at the time.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people believe, that's exactly the reason why they were scheduled to run in this relay. They had been practicing for it. They had earned the right to do it. The last minute, the American coaches changed the lineup for the relay. Jesse Owens is one of the runners who was inserted, who had already won plenty of medals. He even said he didn't need to win another one.
Right.
It kind of helps the case of the coaches to deny that there was any anti-Semitism to it, to say, well, we put Jesse Owens in, like he kind of was the fastest man on earth. So as a coaching decision, it's hard to question that. But Stollerhead and Glickman had earned the right to be there. They're pulled at the last minute, especially Marty Glickman, always believed that it was anti-Semitism at play. Sam Stoller was a little less certain of that. And he thought, there was favoritism involved because the assistant coach for the track team had one of his runners that he put in his place too. So regardless of the reason, it was unfair. And I think it was very likely that it was anti-Semitism at play. Avery Brundage, who's the American Olympic Committee president at that time, future IOC president, incredible anti-Semite.
Not a good guy.
No,
not a good guy.
I went to his archives at the University of Illinois, and the folders that I pulled out were just overflowing with anti-Semitic newsletters that he was subscribing to, letters that were signed to him, Heil Brundage, and he would write complimentary letters back to these people. I was shocked to see that he was writing letters to actual Nazis, asking them to send favorable coverage, quote unquote, favorable coverage of their regime to American newspapers to try to sway public opinion in the United States so that we wouldn't boycott those games. And he was obviously the main proponent of participating and would say things like, this is about sports, not politics. Well, meanwhile, that we shouldn't interfere in the politics of another country. Meanwhile, he's asking the Nazis to interfere in public discourse in his own country.
Right.
I was going to say, with Brundage specifically, it came to a head at the 72 Olympics, of course, given that he was, he's notably the one who made the decision not to cancel any future events or the games after the murder of the 11 Jewish athletes.
Absolutely. The next time the Olympics are back in Germany.
Yeah.
And his Olympic history goes back to when he ran against Jim Thorpe in Stockholm, and his ideas of amateurism, which were such rooted in, the aristocracy, and the idea if you had to earn money by your athletic abilities, that there was something, wrong with that. But, what a significant figure in the Olympic movement for the entire 20th century.
It's interesting thinking about all this through line between, Jim Thorpe, who is, Indigenous American, who is incredibly considered one of the greatest athletes of all time, through the 36 Olympics and sports in the time of Nazism, 72 in Munich and the murder of the Israeli athletes. And your newest book, to segue to that, the story of Glenn Burke, the first openly gay the first openly gay professional athlete.
Jewish too.
But I think the through line through all of it is that politics and sports have always been intertwined and will continue to be. The idea of there's been this adage of like stick to sports that's been hurled at people, and it's sort of like when were we ever sticking to sports? It's always been sort of part and parcel of the whole thing.
Oh, totally. I 100% agree with you. That's why I'm interested in writing these books, whether you call it politics or social justice or, issues of race or anti-Semitism or fascism. I think that's what makes these stories especially interesting, and sports just happens to be the venue where you can tell these stories. But exactly, sports and politics have always marched hand in hand. The Olympics is the very clearest example of that, the way that countries bid on these games, the way they use them for propaganda purposes, the way the athletes compete, not individually, but as nations. So it's inescapable. And I think when people say that, you need to keep these separate, what they're really saying is that there's only a certain brand of politics that they feel is appropriate to be linked to sports, which is sort of that traditional, maybe jingoistic type of politics that doesn't want to address those serious issues we've talked about. And that's a political statement in and of itself, to not talk about those things, not change those things.
Definitely. A lot of leagues are perfectly happy to have a F-16 fly straight over the stadium and say that's not politics, that's America.
Right. Major League Baseball excluding black players until Jackie Robinson came along. That was a political decision.
Absolutely. And I would think that the treatment of gay athletes, certainly in the professional ranks or the professional ranks in North America, it continues to be one of the main, I don't know if I would call it a civil rights issue necessarily, but one of the ongoing issues that hasn't been resolved. And you discuss in the book that, it's sort of amazing that Glenn Burke was this openly gay athlete in the 1970s. And there really, aside from a few cases, there really hasn't been a big openly gay athlete in North America. There's Jason Collins a few years ago who comes out towards the end of his career and plays a few games afterwards. Michael Sam, who's drafted into the NFL, but doesn't play in a regular season game. And, the discourse around Michael Sam a few years ago was like, oh, it's going to be a distraction in the locker room. Mm-hmm. And I think understandably that's been the rhetoric. And that's probably a large part of what's keeping people in the closet who are pro athletes, from sort of expressing themselves and breaking down that sort of last barrier in pro sports.
Yeah, I agree, especially when you're talking about men's sports. I think in women's sports, you've seen more examples of, out lesbian athletes in soccer
Absolutely.
or basketball, right? But men's sports, absolutely. And I think Glenn Burke would be disappointed if he knew that was the case. And on his deathbed, he said he hoped that his experience would make it easier for people in the future. I love that you brought up the idea of Michael Sam being a distraction, and that's often the line that is used by maybe a general manager, right, or owner, or even the media, that having a gay player, an openly gay player, would be a distraction. So I try to point out just the absurdity of that in my book on Glenn by writing about all the distractions that were surrounding the Dodgers and the Oakland A's, the two teams that Glenn Burke played for. So with the Dodgers, Tommy Lasorda was inviting Frank Sinatra and Don Rickles, into the clubhouse.
Right.
Every day he has Don Rickles telling jokes, busting on his players minutes before a playoff game. When Glenn Burke is with the Oakland A's, MC Hammer is the team vice president as a teenage kid. Charlie Finley's paying this teenager and calls him the VP. Finley famously had a mechanical rabbit that would deliver the baseballs to the umpires. So these are managers, owners that are introducing crazy distractions to their teams. Meanwhile, Glenn Burke was the most popular player on the team amongst his teammates. Dusty Baker Davey Lopes said that, he was funny. He kept the atmosphere light, played a lot of music. They loved having him around. And the sports writers who were covering the Dodgers when Glenn was traded to Oakland, because the general manager learned that he was gay, said that Steve Garvey and Don Sutton were sitting at their lockers crying,
right.
About this fourth outfielder getting traded, and so far from a distraction, he was, the most popular person in that clubhouse.
Well, I think one of the one of the theories we continually hear about closeted gay athletes is that the distraction won't come from inside the team. When people argue that it will be a distraction, I'm sure it's safe to say that there are many gay athletes, male athletes, I should say, in North American sports who are out to their friends and teammates, but not to the public. And that, inside the locker room is not necessarily where the problem lies.
Yeah, I think some people would totally agree with that. Others would say, the locker room still isn't the most supportive place, probably.
I'm sure it's not great.
So, yeah,
right.
I think it depends on, the leadership of the team. Like Dusty Baker was the leader in many ways of that team. If Dusty said Glenn was okay, I don't think anybody was going to mess with him. Maybe depends who the manager is, the general manager, the owner, what city you're playing in. And talking to Billy Beane, who was the second openly gay player to come out, after his playing days, not the GM of the Oakland A's, but the other Billy Beane, who works for Major League Baseball now. He said the thing to keep in mind also is the financial risk that these players have to calculate. If they're only going to be a professional athlete at the highest level for 4 or 5 years, if they're lucky, why risk that? Why risk it? Maybe it's safer just to wait 5 years, make an announcement when you're retired if you care to do so. And so I think you have to take that into consideration also.
On a lighter note, I think it's worth pointing out as well, the not exactly a coincidence, but the sort of amazing thing that Glenn Burke, this sort of accidentally groundbreaking player, also helped invent the high five and publicize the high five. And it just sort of, it's like, you wouldn't believe that if they wrote it in a movie like that. It's amazing. I think, I guess for someone, for some of my age to even think that the high five that there was a time before the high five, that there's, a time, I don't even know how people celebrated things, but now it's like, it's so commonplace. But he and Dusty Baker were the sort of the people who made it a thing publicly. And it's an amazing part of the story.
It's crazy, and it just goes to show like what we lose when you stifle people just because they happen to be different. Like here was such a creative person that created a move that everybody in the whole world knows what it is now, But the story is that in the 1977 season, heading into the last month of the season, the Dodgers already had 3 players who had hit 30 or more home runs. Dusty Baker was stuck on 29. And he's stuck on it until the last game of the season. And J.R. Richard is pitching for the Astros. He's throwing 100 miles an hour, and Baker doesn't homer his first 2 at bats, but he does in his third. And Glenn Burke is on deck. The crowd's going crazy. They know the Dodgers have set this record with 4 players with 30 home runs. And Glenn was essentially lifted off his feet by the exuberance of the crowd, and he raises his arm, and Dusty Baker slapped it. And the Dodgers coined the term high five. And it's interesting. They were writing in their game programs like what a high five is, and
right.
When you should do it. It's interesting to see the public kind of educated on this thing that we just take for granted now. And who knows, somebody in Toronto might have high-fived someone in 1932 or something, but they didn't call it a high five and there was nobody there watching. So this is considered the first high five in history.
Now I'm curious if we were prevented, through other sorts of discriminations, if we were prevented from a professional athlete inventing down low too slow.
It's very likely.
Who knows?
That's probably the case, Gabe. Yeah.
Well, I think, Andrew, that's a good place. It's a high note to end it on, a high five note to end it on. Thanks so much for joining us. This has been a great time, great interview. Do you want to give a plug for the book?
Yeah, tell us about the book.
Yeah. All right. So Games of Deception is that first book we were talking about, the story of the 36 Olympics and basketball debuting there. My new book, Singled Out, the biography of Glenn Burke that we were just talking about. And I'm working on a book now that involves Canada. It's the story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal.
Oh, wow.
And so I've completed the research on that. I talked to the Canadian women's coach from that team, Brian Haney, and also a few of the players from the Canadian women's team also. So I'm really looking forward to getting started writing that one. I've got all my research done.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Hopefully you don't have to spend any time researching in an Olympic stadium. A piece of concrete might fall on your head.
Oh, no
Yeah.
kidding. Yeah, I was in. We took a family trip to Canada 2 summers ago. Went to Toronto and Niagara Falls, where you guys are, and also to Montreal. And I visited that stadium for the first time. Never got to see an Expos game there, but it was fun to see it. I remember that's the first Olympics I remember. I'm old enough. I was 6 years old in the '76 Olympics, so to see that venue was cool for me.
There's an interesting story about the basketball team that the captain of the gold medal winning Russian team was Tatiana Ovechkina, who was now the mom of Alex Ovechkin.
Yeah, absolutely.
NHL star.
Yeah, she was on that team. I've got someone in Latvia who is trying to set up an interview with her.
Oh, that's awesome.
He speaks Russian, so he'll do it for me. But I'd love to get her thoughts about those Olympics. They also had a woman named Semenova who was over 7 feet tall and dominated those Olympics.
Wow. You know what? This is obviously something. There's a eugenics portion at play here, I think, with a 7 foot tall basketball player and Alex Ovechkin's parents' father is also a professional athlete. Just thinking about how the Russian government used to create athletes to participate in these Olympic Games.
Absolutely. Hand selected when they were kids to train for these moments.
Absolutely.
I guess we'll have to read that book when it comes out and learn more about these. It sounds very fascinating. Again, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was fun. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much to Andrew Moranis for joining us. As we mentioned, Games of Deception and Singled Out, both available wherever you get your books. Gabe, before we go, I want to shout out a life event for your family. Both your parents got vaccinated.
Yeah, it's very exciting. By the time this airs, both my parents and my in-laws will have vaccinated.
That's great.
Just in time for my child to be born.
Yeah. Big
for
things
the
going on.
Shechechianu of the child. Dude, I know the rabbis were debating it. Did they decide that you should Shechechianu when you get vaccinated?
Oh, I have no idea. That's
that
a good
debate
question.
Was making its way around the internet, or the Jewish corners of the internet over the last little while.
Mike, maybe kick that one over to Bonjour Chai and see if they have an opinion on it. My parents should be vaccinated tomorrow, so that's great. Shout out to them. Everyone who's listening, go get vaccinated whenever you can.
Yes,
go get
your
your parents vaccinated whenever they can.
We're using our platform to promote Big Pharma.
Yeah, that's right. My wife's employers, so good.
All of
it works out. Not one of the vaccine companies, but I don't have a personal stake in them. But yeah,
we are not affiliated with any vaccine, with any of the pharmaceutical companies offering the vaccine.
We're
maybe
just
other
pro-vax.
pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, we're just.
But we are pro-vaccine.
Yeah.
That's true. Do we know? I mean, this is also something for Bonjour Chai, but I want to leave our listeners with it. Do we know if there is like a Jewish anti-vax movement? Like, I know there's a lot of like evangelical Christians and the QAnons who tend to be more anti-vax, but I don't know about if there's like a Jewish one that isn't, like a Satmar Yoel Teitelbaum type group.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I think they're just called the ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
Boy.
I'll tell you something. Do not post that in the CJN Lounge.
Yeah. Well, why don't we leave it there on that slightly anti-Haredi note? Until next time, you can follow us at the Menschwarmers on Twitter. Catch up with us on the CJN Lounge. If there's anything about Jews and sports you hear about, feel free to throw it our way, and we'll talk about it in the next show. And be back in a couple weeks with the baseball preview.